Hello, and welcome to the Dissident Mama podcast. Today, my guest is Pedro L. Gonzalez. Gonzalez is the former assistant editor of American Greatness and now associate editor at Chronicles, a magazine of American culture. He appeared in the Washington Times, The Spectator, Politics, Newsweek, The Federalist, and others. And he's been featured on Fox News, Tucker Carlson Tonight, and Tucker Carlson Today, The Hills with Crystal and Siger, Newsmax's Sovereign Nation with Malkin, The Daily Colors, Jorge Ventura Report, and elsewhere. Gonzalez also creates Contra, home of his Contra newsletter, his podcast Discourses, and his column Super Contra. He's a tough as nails truth teller, so be sure to check out Gonzalez's content, plus his very hot takes on Twitter. Welcome, Pedro.
Thanks so much for having me, and thank you for that nice introduction.
Thank you. So you're a very busy guy. So let's just dump right into it. Dump. No, we're not going to dump. We're going to dive right into it. I first became aware of you, and I think it was 2020 when I read your article at The Agonist called My Father's Eyes. I reread it today, and it's a fascinating article. So I thought maybe we'd kind of start there, and then since it's a little bit biographical and also cultural critique, and then we'll go from there. So this article was fascinating, obviously, about your dad, but about your perception of him and then being an American, but an American of Mexican descent. You had said, my father was a hard man, but one of his 5 brothers had been murdered in Mexico. So when did your father come to the U.S.? Were you born in Ohio or in Mexico?
No, I was actually born in California. I moved to Ohio in 2019, but I was born and raised in California. And my dad came over in the 50s. It's interesting because a lot of my father's life is like mythology in the sense that record keeping in Mexico and the time that he grew up was not great, right? So there's actually been throughout his life 3 different days that he has called his birth date. 3 different dates. And my mother is aware of 3, and they settled on 2 of the 3 being the most likely, just because he passed away in 2017, so he did not know his exact birth date, and so it actually kind of changed over time. Just to give you a sense of what I mean about mythology, where it's just a lot of kind of family lore, right? And then obviously some things are absolutely true, like the fact that his brothers were killed in Mexico, but then there are all these kind of fantastic stories, like that he rode a horse from where he was born in Apaxingán, Michoacán, up much closer toward the border in the 50s. It's like no one knows that that's actually true, that he rode a horse, hundreds of miles or whatever. And then there's these apocryphal stories about him getting into like a knife. I say apocryphal, but multiple people in our family, and I talk about this in the article, mentioned a knife fight that he was in over a woman, where he had to flee this town in Mexico because he had plunged a knife into another guy's stomach because the other guy tried to stab him over a woman. I mean, there's all these. Have you seen the movie Big Fish?
Yes, not in a long time, but I have, yes.
It kind of his like the family lore around him kind of reminds me of the movie Big Fish, where the stories seem larger than life, but they somehow end up being true and stuff. But it's just elements of myth to it. So yeah, I it's just a really interesting relationship with my father, not only because of his story, but when I say that my father was a hard man, I also mean that by the time that I was born, because he had me later in life, he didn't really talk about the past that much. And so I had this strange relationship with my father where we grew up in the same house. I grew up around him, but I actually never really knew that much about him because he simply did not talk about his past all that much. And he was just very kind of stoic. He wasn't always like that, but like I said, by the time that I came of age, he just was kind of very hard and just didn't talk a whole lot. So it's interesting to have to explain that to people. Like, yeah, I always had a dad, and he was always around, but he just didn't talk a whole lot. So I just actually don't know a tremendous amount about my father.
And that is such an interesting essay too, but talk about him as an immigrant and how he had this boss out in California who was this
Yeah.
really like hardline boss, and he appreciated that, and they kind of had like a mutual meeting of the minds.
Yeah.
As far as being raised in California goes, did you just have like normal upbringing? Were you just like middle
Yeah.
class guy?
I grew up in a really rural part of California. It's called, well, I grew up in San Diego County in a really small town called Valley Center. And when I say small town, I mean for most of my adolescence, things did not change until I went into high school. But for most of my time growing up in Valley Center, this was a town with one stoplight, and no one came through unless they were going to Palomar Mountain for recreational stuff. But there was just no reason to go to Valley Center because it was literally in the in the hills of Southern California. But that changed when I later, like I said, around the time that I went to high school, because the town got a casino, which was like the big thing. But my upbringing was, yes, I was born in California, and unfortunately, I ended up after high school mostly imbibing all of these kind of liberal dogmas. But my upbringing was actually in a really rural environment, in a kind of socially conservative town because it was a small town, and I actually spent a lot of time alone when I was very very young because I spent that time outside, like playing by myself. Again, I think I actually was thinking about this recently because I'm a father now, and I have a son who's about to be 2, and I was just thinking about how different our upbringings are. Where he's growing up in more of a kind of suburban town, and I grew up, you know, playing like building forts out of rocks and sticks in rural California. So yeah, it was nice. It was, in retrospect, I was really really lucky to have that childhood. So.
And well, that'd be one of my questions. Did you ever lean left? Did you ever flirt with liberalism shade? Because you are obviously not a left winger today. How would you describe yourself? Paleocon, populist, or do labels not matter?
I think populist, but only in this. The terms I use most consistently are populist and nationalist, but only populist in the sense that I I think that there is a kind of I sympathize with the popular outrage against the established political order, and I'm a nationalist in the sense that I one believe that nations are the most effective political organizing unit that we have, and that two, I think that nations exist. In other words, I think that we should have borders and sovereignty, and that things like
Right.
citizenship actually mean something. Um, but in terms of conservative and liberal, I try to avoid those terms. I do associate myself with paleoconservatism because reading paleoconservatives was the thing that really kind of changed my thought. But my upbringing was apolitical. My parents were not political at all. They were extremely socially conservative because they're Hispanic Catholics, so that they were just kind of by nature conservative. But in social terms, politically, I write in that essay that you brought up that my dad basically liked presidents based on how manly and like tough he thought they were, which is fine. Like I think that's great, but they were not political. Like there was no political table talk at our house or anything like that. And that was actually great. Again, in retrospect, thinking about the world that my son and my daughter are growing up in, and the world that I grew up in, it was a bubble of bliss, basically until high school. And then after high school, that's when everything kind of changed, and I was exposed to political stuff, political content. But in high school, it was really a kind of like wonderful rural bubble of blissful ignorance where the most important thing of your life was like your crush, or like the game on Friday or something like that, like a
Yeah.
wrestling match or something. Like that was it. That was like the most important thing that was happening. That I'm sure that was different for some other students that were really already kind of looking at like what school they wanted to go to. But for me and for most of my friends, we didn't even think about politics. But then after high school, yeah, I was exposed to politics and stuff like that, and I just kind of became a liberal, and just because that's in the atmosphere in California, right? It's like the ambient liberalism, and you just kind of imbibe all of it, and then you're like, okay, well, this is true. This is not actually liberalism. This is just kind of objective fact.
Right.
So,
Fact. Yeah. Another thing from that article, I mean, Pedro writes all the time, y'all. You're going to have to read all his stuff, but this one was the first introduction for me to his writing. And it really is, it's a fascinating thing. And you're writing, I love this sentence: Mexico is home to the Hobbesian reality that lurks just beyond the pruned hedges of civilization. I mean, that's amazing. So tell us a little bit about that and how much you identify with being a Mexican, if you even are into hyphens and things like that.
yeah.
But also, there's something else, I don't have it written down here, but what you had in the article, which people are going to read, about how being an immigrant to a nation and being allowed in is like being a guest at a dinner table, and that's how your dad saw it. And that's, I assume, what you're touching back to, which I thought was a very simple yet profound way to explain it.
Yeah, and so the Hobbesian thing, what I'm getting at is just the line between civilization and civilizational breakdown is very thin. And Mexico is what it look. Mexico is, it's somewhere between a failed state and a dysfunctional state, and I think even that's kind of a blurry line. But I mean, it is basically, in some ways, that actually means you can almost be freer in Mexico, except for the fact that you're terrorized by the cartels. But I mean, in a weird way, if you think about it, like the government is probably less able to kind of manage your life in a place like Mexico than in the United States, because the bureaucracy in the United States or in somewhere like Germany is much more effective at doing its job, right? So in some ways, there's it's paradoxically, in a place like Mexico, you can be freer in some sense, but on the other hand, that freedom also comes with the great terror of the cartels that do whatever they want. They are a law unto themselves. These cartels, right? So that's really what I'm getting at, is this idea that civilization is much more fragile than people think it is. And I think the shooting in Texas right now is bringing a lot of these questions to people's mind. You know, that I have been hesitant to comment on it because I think it's such a mess that it's one of these things where it's like, what is the solution? Like, it's not gun control. It's I'll come back to your other question, but I mean, this is really an incredible scenario where you have a young person who is mentally unstable, who, we're going to learn more about that. So mentally unstable young person, uh, police who were afraid to go into this school, like that's the thing that's captured the news. And then you have celebrities and former President Barack Obama who made the entire thing about themselves. And it just, yeah, I mean, this is a civilization that is in crisis. But um, going back to the other point that you brought up about how I view myself as a Mexican American or someone of Mexican ancestry, uh, I think in that piece, the thing that I was getting at was that. Oh, sorry, were you going to say something? Oh,
I was
okay.
just clearing my
Oh,
throat.
okay. Um, in the piece, what I was getting at is that although I do obviously consider myself assimilated into the mainstream of American culture, uh, I'm not. I still kind of am able to see things from the outside looking in. Like when I see white liberals, among which I count a lot of conservative, like politicians and pundits, by the way, when I see them self-flagellating, apologizing for their history and for apologizing for their ancestry, to me, it's just bizarre. Because it's kind of like looking through a window at someone doing something very strange inside of like a studio or a shop, and you're just kind of like wondering, like, why are they doing that? And so on the one hand, obviously, I've come around to my father's position of viewing a nation like a home, and therefore, if you're an immigrant, if you're a newcomer, then you should learn the house manners, right? How people live, or in practical terms, like the language. What is not considered socially acceptable in this culture versus other cultures, like basic things that create the texture of life. I agree with that. But on the other hand, I think that texture is kind of breaking down and changing. And it is really stark for me precisely because I'm not white. And so to see people who are like, I'm ashamed of my ancestors who fought on the Confederate side of the Civil War hundreds of years ago. It's like, why? Why are you ashamed? Like, why do you feel guilt for your past, for something that you're not responsible for? Why do you hate yourself over this? It just that's the thing that I'm really getting at in that article.
Right, and that, I guess, gets you called some kind of psyop, or maybe a Fed or a honeypot. I'm not sure, but it has gotten you into some trouble, I know. And you write for.
Tio Thomas.
Go ahead.
That's I was gonna say
Go.
Tio Tom, like Uncle Tom. Tio,
Yeah.
Uncle, Tio Tomas. That's what I get.
Ah. All right. So you write for Chronicles, and this is on the Chronicles. It's dedicated to defending and advancing the philosophical and spiritual foundations of Western civilization. So would you say that's what you do at Chronicles and beyond? And then I wanted to say something just real quick about Paul Gottfried. Is he considered like your boss? Is he?
Paul is kind of like our figurehead in the sense that he obviously he has as an editor he does help oversee and manage things, but I think more importantly Paul is that, like, he represents um, what Chronicles has stood for the last 45 years, because that's how long it's been around. So when you see Paul Gottfried, you kind of understand who we are, what we're doing, and the positions that we take, right? So Paul has, apart from his actual role, which is my superior, he plays a kind of important symbolic role. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, and I'll get back to that question of what's what you think your job is. But I that's one thing I really about your writing and Paul Gottfried. Paul Gottfried defends the South more than a lot of Southerners I know. And he's saying, "Get out there. What are you doing? Why are you letting them tear down your ancestry or your heritage? It's nothing to be ashamed of." And sometimes
Yeah.
I think it speaks to your point earlier, where perhaps sometimes he's ethnically Jewish, but he's from the north, but see from the outside how ludicrous it is. Sometimes when you've used the word a lot, and a lot of people who live in the South, who are from the South, who have that kind of ancestry, are imbibed with just this self-hatred. And sometimes it
Yeah.
takes somebody from the outside looking in to try to shake people. So that is what I think you do. And do you think you're defending Western civilization?
Well, it's funny because it's such a lofty mission statement, right? I just think that I help people see things more clearly, and I'm good at framing problems. I think that's really what I do. Is I don't want to go so far as to say I'm saving anything, but I think what I do is I just help people see things the way that I think that they need to be framed,
Right.
and I have a kind of toolkit and a method for doing that, and that's what I see myself as doing. And I also try to take things that are controversial, take things that are misunderstood or maligned, and then rehabilitate them and introduce them to a broader audience. That is that is something that I've been doing since before I joined Chronicles, and I think it's important. Trying to give examples of this stuff, but I guess Chronicles itself is exactly this. It was before it became actually one of the magazines that kind of defended the candidacy of Donald Trump. It was also the ideological flagship for Pat Buchanan's presidential campaigns. And at a time when most of the media was making fun of him or demonizing him or whatever, Chronicles was defending Buchanan and batting away, the accusations that he's like a bad person or whatever, and instead explaining to the audience actually, Pat Buchanan is a political expression of a social movement made up of middle Americans who feel that they have been left behind and exploited by their own government, and they don't recognize the country that they live in anymore. And that is kind of what I see myself as doing, is being, an explainer. And so there are different levels of thinkers, like first order, second order, third order. I think I wouldn't even want to put myself on that kind of a ranking, but in other words, I don't do so much original work as I do kind of using the tools that and systems that I've learned from other thinkers like Paul Gottfried, and then apply those to current events and the issues we're dealing with now to break them down in a way that's easy to understand, and more importantly, like removes, I guess, the taboo. So I'll give you an example. I just wrote an article for Newsweek about the Great Replacement, and the point that I was making is like there is this attempt to make it basically not okay to talk about immigration anymore because of what happened in Buffalo. That if you talk critically about immigration, you're responsible for the next mass shooting if you're not already responsible for this one, because it was motivated by because in the shooter's manifesto he had mentioned demographic replacement, whatever. Okay, in the Newsweek article, I explained that you don't actually need to take anyone who makes that argument seriously, because the biggest advocates of demography as a political weapon are actually Democrats. And the same liberals who are telling you you're not allowed to talk about immigration critically anymore because this is what happens. And so I took basically an issue that I think was really taboo and kind of, demystified it and showed people, here's what Democrats have been saying in their own words for decades about how they're going to replace you, but now you're not allowed to talk about demography or immigration anymore. And so I think that's maybe one practical example of the kind of work that I try to do.
Yeah, it's like connect dots. And there's so many things in our culture that I just think that everybody knows by now. They have to know this great replacement thing is happening, or that obviously anti-whiteness is a thing. And then
Yeah.
some tragedy happens and everybody don't know what's going on. It's crazy. It's like you have to write the same things over and over because
Yeah.
you're still trying to make people just wake up to the basic reality they're living in,
Yeah.
and either are too scared to talk about or just refuse to see.
Yeah, that's right. And that was the thing that really appalled me in the wake of Buffalo, was the fact that literally the same people and the same media outlets that have been for years talking about how demography favors the Democrats, how we are going to replace all of those racist white people through immigration, through like, dwindling birth rates, whatever. All of the same people, all the same institutions that have been saying that and advocating it as a legitimate political strategy, we're suddenly now saying this is your fault, Republican politician or Tucker Carlson or whatever, because you said bad things about immigration. So that
Right.
shooter, that blood is on your hands. And the thing is that I think for like a brief moment, it did kind of freak people out. But the thing that actually gave me some hope for the future was the fact that there was such an aggressive pushback on that from not just people like me,
Mm-hmm.
but fairly mainstream conservatives were saying like, no, 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 no. You people have been promoting demographic, replacement and that kind of stuff for decades. Like, you're not going to shut us down now and try to basically run this smear campaign where you blame us for this tragedy. So times are
Were
changing.
you? Yeah, I was going to say, were you shocked that there wasn't more left wing umph, or left wing hay made out of the Buffalo thing? I mean, I know there's still, but George Floyd happened. 2 months later, there's riots, and then there's riots for 2 months. I mean, this guy had a pro-white manifesto or whatever. It just seems like maybe it's because there are many tragedies, but I really think my white pill is that, it's because there are people like you out there who are just unbeen trying to connect the dots. I mean, what do you think? You said things are changing. How do you mean?
Well, I think that things are changing in the sense that more mainstream figures are more willing to speak out today against things that are considered taboo, although they're not really, um, than they were, say, 5 or 6 years ago. So I think that's changing, and I think that's owed to the the Donald Trump era. I think that basically the era of being politically incorrect, or not being afraid to say things that kind of upset the establishment. So I think that's one part of it. Another part of it, I think, is just it's a kind of oversaturation of tragedy, an oversaturation of the current thing, right? Like you were being bombarded with stuff about Ukraine, and now you're being bombarded with stuff about Buffalo, and now you're being bombarded with stuff about Texas, and it's just like the next thing and the next thing. But at the same time that happens, people notice the inconsistency in the way that this stuff works, right? So, like Kenosha last year, Waukesha last year, the Christmas massacre. The media tried pretty hard to just memory hold that whole thing because the killer's profile did not fit the preferred profile for the media, which is a white male with vaguely conservative views. And so people remember how the media reacted to Waukesha, where the Washington Post was running headlines like SUV drives into crowd. SUV drove into crowd by itself? Who was the driver? And then framing him as a kind of basket case. Well, his political views have nothing to do with it. This is clearly somebody who's mentally ill, and then basically trying to kind of downplay what happened, right? People remember that versus how Buffalo is being handled, where you have the guy who did the shooting. He's still around, and he wrote down why he did it, right? And in his 180-page screed, he talks about how he's actually pro LGBT. He just doesn't really like transgender people, but he says, I'm actually supportive of the LGBT community. And he describes himself as moderate authoritarian left. And then he also talks about demography in this. But that was the only thing the media latched onto was his comments about demography. Never mind that the guy was clearly like a mentally unstable schizophrenic, and he shouldn't have been out anyways. The media took it and made it about white supremacy. And what I'm saying is that at some point, this stuff gets so cynical and so transparently cynical that it just kind of loses its sting. When it's kind of like crying wolf or crying fire so many times that eventually your audience is no longer really receptive to it. And maybe another analogy is like torture. It doesn't work if you do it all the time. If you continually torture someone, it eventually they kind of just I think they stop caring, right?
Right.
And I think that's kind of where a lot of people are, where they'll hear like the media narrative and they'll roll their eyes and be like, they're doing it again. So
Yeah.
I think that's something that has changed is that a lot of people are kind of just burnt out by it, but also see through it.
Right. I guess it was Lenin or somebody one step forward, two steps back, and there's never any steps backward anymore with progressivism. So, do you think they're just overplaying their hand on everything?
I think so. I think that there's certainly a level of there's a level of extremism that we haven't really seen before with a lot of this stuff, or at least thanks to social media, which is both a terrible thing and it can be a useful thing, thanks to accounts like Libs of TikTok and others who have taken what these people are saying, what these, whatever you want to call them, progressives or left wing ideologues or liberals, whatever, basically taking them at their word and then presenting them to a mass audience. I think it's definitely true that it seems like the intensity of the insanity has never been this high before because you have you have people that are arguing that children at talking about like under 10 years old should be able to get sex reassignment surgeries when they feel a little bit of gender confusion, because their teacher at school behind the backs of the parents told them, you think you're a boy but you're actually a girl. And that confusion that results from that should become the basis for a medical intervention. Like that is insane and it's extreme. But it's so insane and so extreme that it's also provoked a kind of reaction that we haven't seen in a long time, and it's manifesting in this grassroots, call it the parents' rights movement, where you have parents going to war with schools, going to war with school boards, running for elections in their school districts and stuff like that. So I think that you're already seeing that reaction. You're already seeing people starting to really fight back in a way that we haven't seen in a long time, and you're seeing people tune out the attempts to kind of silence opposition or shame them or slander them or whatever. So on the one hand, things are crazier than they've ever been, but the amount of fight that I see in people gives me hope.
Yeah, and one of the things that gave me hope was, what was it, about 6 months ago, maybe a year ago, when the British neocon Douglas Murray went after you and
Oh yeah,
called you all sorts of names. You can explain to the listeners, just give us a little primer on what that was. But the best part of the story is that nobody you knew threw you under the bus. People came out
yeah,
loud and
yeah,
proud for Pedro.
yeah,
And that's what I've been trying to tell people for years. You don't have to be the person who puts yourself out there, but don't virtue signal against them when somebody calls them a name. This is
yeah,
how the left gets power. And it was such a hugely optimistic moment when people just
yeah,
came out of the woodwork for you. So can you tell listeners just kind of what down
yeah.
with that?
So I had tweeted, I had, because I do this I used to do it a lot more, but I'm more careful now. But I made fun of the appearance of two people who happened to be Jewish. And Douglas Murray took those two tweets that I had made and then wrote an article where he called me an anti Semite, published through Barry Weiss's Substack, very subtly with a swastika as the image. And
Of
the
course.
article was so ridiculous, and the
Hmm.
claim that he made was so absurd that there was this tremendous backlash against Murray for writing it. And it was hilarious that actually some of the people who were the loudest in my corner defending me were Jews, were other Jews who were actually aligned with Murray, people that respected him.
Right.
But they were saying stuff like, this is shameful, uh, like you're weaponizing this charge, and using it to knock out someone who is much younger than you are and who is kind of up and coming, and it's just like the entire thing was so bad that it actually backfired on Murray. Like he lost credibility. Like the amount of people that told me, I used to be a big fan of Murray, but after what he did to you, I have to reassess everything that I think about him, or like I unsubscribed to the Spectator because of that. The amount of support that I had was actually really astounding, and
Yeah.
it wasn't like just dissident figures. It was like mainstream people were coming out and saying, like, if they weren't directly counter signaling Murray, they were saying, they would just kind of, we would, like you say, subtweet, I guess, right? They would just say, like, Pedro is a a talented journalist or whatever, and what people are saying about him is not true. And so yeah, it was for a lot of people. I think that was a pivotal moment, and I think it was actually Mike
Hmm.
Cernovich who said, "It's not 2016 anymore. You can't
Hmm.
just cancel people by calling them a racist or a sexist or an anti-Semite anymore. That stuff doesn't that it just doesn't work anymore." But again, the thing that made it so interesting was the fact that it came technically from a conservative. Although
Yeah.
I say technically because I don't really consider Murray a conservative. Um, and I think the other aspect of this is that it reminded people a lot of the old kind of gatekeeping that conservatism is known for. That when you have a populist who's saying things, because I mean, this is all speculative, but Murray's not a dumb person. Murray's actually very smart. He's very well read, smarter than I am. So why did he write that? Why did he make such a horrendous argument that it was just laughable on its face, right? This is a very smart person. So why would he do something so dumb? I have no idea. But I think that was another thing that actually counted against him, was like, you're smarter than this. Like, why did you do, like, who put you up to this kind of a thing?
Yes.
No one really knows, but yeah, I mean, it was certainly very encouraging that I not only survived that, but I came out actually, I think, better off because of that, because it actually galvanized a lot of people to my side. It's like, if Douglas Murray is attacking you on Barry Weiss's Substack, then you must be doing something right. And the weird thing is that Barry Weiss follows me on Twitter, and she never reached out to me and asked me, "Hey, what did you mean by this?" Which I would have explained to her. It's
Right.
like, well, it's a joke because they're weird looking people who have weird opinions. But she never reached out to me. Douglas Murray didn't reach out to me. We have a lot of mutual friends and associates, but there was no attempt to ask me anything. So
Right.
it's really very strange, but it worked out.
So yeah, it was a wonderful moment. I'm going to link to some of that in the show notes, some Twitter threads about it, because if you live through it, folks, it was just an amazing time. So speaking of speaking of neocons, so you had written somewhere in one of your articles, I do not consider America to be a social contract, a proposition, or a mere set of enlightenment ideas packaged and to be handed out at a border to New. That sounds very not neocon, and it kind of sounds not very Claremont Institute sometimes. However, you are a Lincoln Fellow, of all things, at the Claremont Institute. So how did you get involved with them? Do you still have a good relationship with them? I know there are some good people who work for them, but it's that whole whatever. Straussians versus the old right, paleocons and the Noel Bradford stuff and all this stuff. So how did you get involved with Claremont? What's it like to be a Lincoln Fellow?
Yeah. By the way, there's some kind of a distortion when you talk. It sounds like you're a robot. I don't know what that is, but it might be a problem with your microphone. But anyways, just so you know, so your listeners know why that I can hear it too. But with the Lincoln Fellow thing, I mean, you're right. Claremont has this kind of history of being associated with neoconservatism, but even with them, it has a kind of strange relationship, because Claremont or West Coast Straussians have been known to fight with neoconservatives. But I think it's fair to say that in their past, they were certainly much more neoconservative than they are today. A lot of the younger Claremont people, like Michael Anton, as opposed to the guys who are a little bit older, have moved more in a paleo direction, although their rhetoric does not always reflect that. In terms of the political preferences that they have and the political choices that they make, they're actually very much they're more aligned actually with paleoconservatives than like Sean Hannity. That's not a great that's not a great example, but I guess a lot of the younger Claremont guys are more aligned with the old paleocons in terms of their preferences than some of the other conservatives who rhetorically sound, I guess, more hard nosed. I don't know how else to put it. Paul Godfrey was actually the one that pointed this out. He was like, if you listen to Claremont people, they actually sound kind of to the left of some mainstream conservative pundits when they talk about the proposition nation and stuff like that. But if you actually pay attention to like how they what their political writing and stuff, they're actually much more aligned with us than not. At least, like I said, the younger guys. And so I applied to be a Lincoln Fellow, and I got it. It was actually a really great experience, and I would say most of the fellows there were not West Coast Straussians, and it was actually a great experience in the sense that we argued a lot with because every day is like a seminar, and so we would kind of mix it up with the presenters. And it was really fun because we would they would it would get kind of a little bit heated, but like in a friendly way, Uh, and but that was actually the thing that really impressed a lot of us, was the fact that they brought together a bunch of people who didn't agree with them. And I didn't change my mind by the time that I left. Like, I still don't agree with them on some things, but I agree with them on a lot of important things, and that's really what matters. And I actually came out of that fellowship with some lifelong friends. And I mean, in my application, I actually wrote, I want to come to the fellowship because I think that it would be a good way for me to meet like-minded people, but I don't need this fellowship because I've been able to make it on my own so far. I wrote almost verbatim something like that, basically saying like, I'd love to attend and meet people who think like me, but uh, I don't need this. So, and I thought maybe that would, I don't know. I thought that would be kind of an interesting way because it was actually how I felt, right?
Right.
Uh, that was, I just put on paper how I felt. Like it'd be great if I got in, but I'm not gonna. It's not gonna be the end of the world if I don't because I've managed to cut it on my own so far. But there was actually like two other people that made really similar submissions where they're like, I don't agree with you. I respect a lot of the work you do, but I fundamentally disagree with you on this. Yeah, I hope you accept my application. And all like myself and the other guy that I know of that made a really similar submission, we went there. We disagreed with Claremont. We agreed with them on some things, and we left. And by the time that we left, we all like were, like I said, like good friends and stuff. So it was a really cool experience, and I have actually a tremendous amount of respect for Claremont for all the work that they do. So although I mean, there's a history of like of bad blood between paleocons and like the Jaffa people, but the younger people don't care about that. Like I don't that stuff doesn't bear on my mind. Like the feud between Harry Jaffa and Mel Bradford. Like I don't care. It's 2022. So and what matters is that Michael Anton is like what matters is what Michael Anton is doing today. Defending Trumpism, defending a nation with borders and stuff like that. So,
Do I still sound like a robot?
no, no longer.
Good. Woo. So we'll move on. Got a little bit more time. So the whole neocon thing, one of the things that drives me crazy among the many things that neocons do is they just hate the South, and they hate anybody who doesn't love Abraham Lincoln, and they love writing books about how horrible Robert E. Lee is and all this kind of stuff. It's this whole anti-Southern industry. So you call yourself nationalist, but are you also pro-secession too? Like, if that just happened to happen, because trying to put 340 million people together and make us all get
No.
along is pretty hard. Like, what is your view on secession and maybe even the war between the states? And how do you make that jibe with being a nationalist if there's enough contradictions there?
Well, I think I understand the tendency towards division, and I actually just did another podcast where I said that I think this is actually like the American debate is whether we stay together or split up. That has been the American debate since probably before even the debates over ratifying the Constitution. But my main issue with secession is that I just don't see a scenario where that does not result in civil war. I just can't. Not because of, ironically, because of the left. I don't think that they would allow us to secede. I think that there's something about leftism that is just inherently imperialistic, where they can't stand it that the people living on the same continent as them, but over there, don't agree with the way of life that they want, and I just think that it would inevitably result. And then you have this whole problem of like, how would you even do it? Like Texas, people think that like, oh, obviously Texas would be one of the places that go along with this with secession, but there are deeply blue like suburbs in Texas. Like, what would happen to them? I talk to parents in Texas about what's going on with like transgenderism and critical race theory, and they tell me like we basically have to keep moving to new areas because the suburb that we lived in turned blue. So how would you like if you want to secede and you're in Texas, like how would you do that? It's just logistically it just doesn't make sense to me. But I think at any rate the work is the same whether you're a nationalist like I am, or someone who thinks that secessionism is inevitable. I think the work is the same. And by the work, I mean that we need to capture state governments instead of basically focusing on what's going on in Washington D.C. and hoping that we get a good president. Every turn of the moon. The focus should actually be on shoring up the states, winning local elections for your school board, for your sheriff's office, uh, winning the governor's office. Like that is actually the thing that we should be focusing on. And whether you're a nationalist like I am, or someone who, like I said, is pro secession, it's still the same kind of work. Basically fixing the states, because that is actually how you can protect yourself. And the states have a tremendous amount of power, especially governors, that we just don't really ever tap into and use.
Right. That would actually be a very pro-Southern sentiment, right? It's not that it's a three-legged stool, of the government, but that it's four, and the states are actually what prop it up. So the whole think locally, act locally thing, absolutely. We just had primaries here, and the only reason I was excited to go to the polls was to vote for a good person in there for sheriff to run against the Democrat we have. So yeah, that's a really good. Do you think there are any ramifications of the war, the late unpleasantness, as some of us call it, as far as the continuing deconstruction that we're experiencing today, or do you think it's something totally different?
Are you talking about Ukraine?
No, I was actually talking about the war between the states, but we could tie those together too. My last question was going to be about Ukraine, but the way I see the war between the states would be that Reconstruction never ended. That what we're living through today, this war, same thing.
I think I get what you're saying, but I don't know enough about your position to really speak to it. But I will say that actually, the neoconservative view does actually remind me of this kind of desire to reconstruct the country in your vision, the way that you want things to look. And I think that that's understandable to a degree, because basically you want where you live to match what you think it should look like. But taken to its most extreme position, where the neoconservatives are, you actually abstract your nation. You don't just abstract the community where you live, Ohio or whatever. The entire concept of the nation dissolves at that point, because what it means to be an American is simply a set of, I guess, ideas. Which is why I've written about this and made this analogy of just handing out Happy Meals, and that's what makes you an American. And in some ways, that's actually what neoconservatives do consider to be an American: someone who goes to the same shopping malls as everyone else, someone who shops at McDonald's or eats at McDonald's, someone who does jury duty and takes out a loan to buy a car. Like that's what makes you an American, according to neoconservatives. So I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I think the really interesting part of it is that you even hear Democrats like AOC talk about the South, and not just the South, but other parts of red states, I think is the term that she used. She said that red states are not free states, they're oppressed states, and that they have to be liberated. That is literally how neoconservatives talk about the world. That's how they talk about Iraq and Afghanistan. Really, really interesting dynamic there, that you this idea. I mean, well, Francis Fukuyama, who once denounced the neoconservatives, he actually compared it to Leninism. And he said that Bolshevism had emerged in the Soviet Union as tragedy, and it has reemerged in the United States as farce under neoconservatism. That was Francis Fukuyama. That's why he split for a time from the neoconservative movement and formed a publication called The American Interest, was because he had this break with neocons who he compared to Leninists. So yeah, it is really, really fascinating, the fact that neoconservatives do actually share a lot of qualities with Leninists in their desire to kind of use will to shape the entire world. And to be fair, I kind of also sometimes lean in the direction of wanting to use power to get my way, but yeah. But at least I'm aware of the limits of what can be done, whereas neoconservatives don't have limits. Like they will literally like you listen to the way they talk about foreign policy, and it's like, well, the mistake we did in Iraq was that we didn't kill enough young men. And because we didn't kill enough young men, the insurgency was able to come back in Iraq. It's like, excuse me, you're talking about genocide as foreign policy. And they're like, yeah, well, that's the price of democracy. But if you're willing to do that in Iraq, why wouldn't you be willing to do that here in the United States?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm working on a series now. It's just about Russia, Ukraine, and through a Southern lens. And that's exactly what I'm trying to point out to people who immediately jumped on the Ukraine bandwagon with the stuff. It's like they're going to, and then they're going to bring it back here. And even though they're helping Nazis, you're still a Nazi, and you just better slow down here. So let's talk about Ukraine. You've written a lot about it, and you came out with an article today called "Servant of the Corrupt," and it's quite a piece. Can you tell the listeners what are the Pandora Papers?
So the Pandora Papers, it's just this massive set of documents that were leaked to a series of journalistic institutions. It was this like global collaborative effort. And basically the main takeaway from the Pandora Papers is that it revealed where public officials, civil servants, government officials all over the world hide their money. So the papers focus on these havens, and they showed that the most corrupt place that we have data on in the papers in Europe, in other words, the place where you have the most the greatest number of people hiding their money in these havens, it's Ukraine. And Russia is included in the Pandora Papers, but Ukraine actually trumps even Russia in the number of people that you have hiding their money there, who are serving as like public officials. So the bottom line is that this is a country that is extremely corrupt and has a long history of specializing in stealing international aid money. And this is all known until recently. This is not a secret. This is not controversial at all. Like literally until last year, Ukraine was understood to be one of the most corrupt countries on earth, where money just disappears into black holes. But that has all been forgotten, and now Ukraine is a beacon of democracy. If Ukraine falls, Louisiana is next, and you're not allowed to say anything mean about President Zelensky, who's the paragon of democracy. It's just insane. I hate to use this word, but it's like the great gaslighting. We're all being told to believe things that are just so false on their face, and we knew that a few months ago. And one of the things I talk about in my piece is that if you go back to just January of this year, you'll see that public polling was overwhelmingly against Zelensky in Ukraine, because his presidency has been marked. If you don't know, he ran as an anti-corruption candidate, and he turned out to be just as corrupt as all of his predecessors. And so there was a talk of something happening to him. Like people were threatening to throw him out by force, like they did Yanukovych in 2014. So this was not a popular president, but then the war happens and his image is completely remade. He is the greatest example of the leader of a free country, and it's a joke, and it's a sad joke, because the people that will pay for this in blood are Ukrainians. And anybody else if this thing expands beyond the borders of Ukraine.
Yes, and
I mean, the point that I stress at the very end is that we are being forced to subsidize this.
Yeah.
We are being forced to subsidize Ukraine fighting to the last Ukrainian against Russia, not for surprise democracy, but just for cold, calculated geopolitical interest, which is weakening Russia. That is exactly what Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has said. Our goal in Ukraine is to weaken Russia. It's like, excuse me, the United States is at war with Russia?
Right.
Not officially.
Yeah, and you had said, Ukraine falls, so Louisiana, but paying for the stuff, Louisiana might fall. We all might fall because you have the money, and we're paying $100 million a day to really wrap your mind around that while, we're all here dealing with the crazy gas prices and the shortages and, the coming phase, the heck's going to happen. And they're going to wake up to the huge, I don't know. It's just like been a trick, this media trick to make people believe something that is just untrue, and we're fighting for the good guys and that we are the good guys. How do you think it's going to turn? I mean, Russia's doing pretty well military, and is it just going to keep going on forever?
I don't know. There's so much about the war that is just defined by confusion and misinformation, ironically, mostly from the West, right?
Mhm.
I think that it's certainly true that the war has not gone according to plan for Russia, that this has been much harder than they thought it would be. But I think it's also true that despite the triumphalism, the talk that, Ukraine is just another 40 billion away from victory, that doesn't seem true to me. It seems like Ukraine is actually
Mhm.
incurring incredible amounts of losses. And because you're hearing two things. One, that Russia is super incompetent, its military is about to collapse. It was supposed to collapse at least 3 times now I'm not kidding, that I've been keeping track of. There would be predictions like in the middle of I think that 2 months ago there was a prediction that like in 10 days Russia's army would finally collapse. And then 20 days later somebody else said 10 more days. Didn't happen. That was like a month ago. And this has happened several times, right? So again, while I think it's definitely been a much harder fight for Russia. What you're hearing from Ukraine is we're this close to winning, but also if the West does not intervene more dramatically now, we're going to lose. There was a headline today, and it was something like Ukraine hopes U.S. heavy weapons will turn the tide of the war. And it's like, wait, I thought they were winning. What do you mean turn the tide? Or when the Moskova sank, that Russian ship, and that was like turned into the big story of the month. That ship sank at the same time that it was at the same time, like literally in the same week that it became obvious that this significant port city, Mariupol, was going to fall. That wasn't the story. The story was that this ship that was built like in the 70s was sinking. And it was like, yes, it's the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, but what's more important? A ship sinking in the Black Sea, uh, or a really important, vital port city falling to the Russians? It's pretty obvious which one of these things is more important, but the main story was the Moskova. And again, you're being told that the Ukrainians are winning, they're winning, they're winning. The Moskova sinks, and then you've got the Wall Street Journal saying this is a turning point in the war for Ukraine, or this could be a turning point in the war for Ukraine. And it's like, wait, I thought they were winning. What do you mean a turning point? And so you can kind of read between the lines and figure it out for yourself that like I don't think this is actually going that well for Ukraine. But our leaders are cynical enough that they on the one hand need to believe that it is, and on the other hand they need you to believe that it is, for a variety of different
Mhm.
reasons that have nothing to do with democracy, freedom, nationalism, or even the welfare of Ukrainians. So,
Well, y'all are all going to
or
have to
Americans or
read.
Russians or anybody.
That's true. Yes, we can't forget about them as well. It's just no good for anybody. Nobody who's not making bank over there, which
Yeah.
most of us are not. So, y'all need to read all of phenomenal. And you just heard he connects the dots and asks the questions that we're scratching our head, but he does such a great job articulating those. And you got to follow him on Twitter too, because I just love the way you rag on the mainstream journalists and all the people who say ludicrous things, and it's so refreshing. And I thank you so much for coming on my, especially on an evening where you are going to be spending time with your beautiful family. I hope I have not taken too much of your time, and I just thank you and pray for you to keep up the fight, because you're a warrior and we really hate it out here.
Thank you. Appreciate that.